I play a lot of war games. That means I need a lot of wargaming boards. There are plenty of great options out there, but I am limited by storage space and tabletop size. So in today's video, I am making a double-sided wargaming board that can be stored by hanging on your wall and hidden in plain sight. Not too long ago, before retiring, Luke from Geek Gaming created a hidden board using a frame from a poster. I knew I wanted to make something like this, but with both sides playable, and having a side I found visually appealing. That's when I found this 3-foot by 3-foot level 3 canvas at Michael's craft store. Normally this canvas costs like $80-ish, and rightfully so, it's a decent heavy duty canvas. Every so often there'll be a sale, and I was able to get this one for 70% off, and it only cost me $22. I jumped on this because I knew I probably couldn't even buy the materials for a 3-foot by 3-foot gaming board for that much. So a battle plan was devised, and I decided the front would be similar to a battle mat, with a printed design, and the recessed inside of the canvas would give me room to make a realistic wargaming board with some fixed terrain features, and the whole thing could be hung up on the wall for storage. I could have painted a realistic top-down image of the countryside or like the surface of the moon, but I want to hang this on the wall and not have it be weird when people come over. Instead, I decided to go with an acrylic paint board. If you're unfamiliar, this is the technique of just pouring paint onto a canvas, moving it around to make different designs. Artists who paint pour usually use a soft body acrylic paint and an acrylic medium to help the paint flow better, since you can't use water to thin it without the colors losing their saturation. To cover a 3-foot by 3-foot canvas, I'm going to need a lot of paint. And to save some money, and for the sake of science, I'm going to do something crazy and use cheap craft paint. I got these top-notch paints on sale for 50 cents a bottle, and we'll pour them directly onto the canvas. I'm not going to thin them down with anything to hopefully keep the colors as bright and vibrant as possible. Before possibly ruining my $80 canvas, I tried my hypothesis out on a small, much cheaper canvas. The paint is poured out in a basic form, and then using my airbrush, I push the colors around together to make this marbled look. There is some resistance from the dry canvas that is preventing the paint from spreading more. I ended up adding more paint to cover the edges of the canvas. The colors might seem like a strange choice, but I decided to use reds to create an alien planet so I could use this for my Star Wars Shatterpoint miniatures. I probably should have stopped at this point, but it was really interesting to see how the airbrush moved areas with a lot of paint around. You could almost force out colors from the multiple layers and spread them across the canvas. When I was happy with what I had, I left it for about 3 days. Once it completely dried, I could get a closer look and see what I learned. My first observation was that if there's too much paint in a given area, it will build up and split, leaving these small cracks. And the second thing was a reminder that color is super important with something like this. You want a nice range of colors that are related and go together, but you also want to be able to create contrast. This purple works because it's my deepest dark and still has some red in it. And this nacho cheese yellow doesn't and creates a bit too much of a contrast and may be distracting when playing a game on top of it. I do, however, like this marbled red and white. This is what I'm going for, as it looks like that planet from The Last Jedi. Having run a test and knowing what changes had to be made, I prepared the 3-foot canvas. This time I'm starting with an underpainting of red. The canvas was much coarser and absorbent than the last one, and the hope is that this red paint underbelly will help the other paint flow better. After the first batch of the paint was poured out, I noticed my airbrush wasn't powerful enough to push the paint around the way I wanted. More paint was added, but now it was starting to pool and would crack when it dried. Some areas were completely reset by removing the paint with a large brush. I had thought this entire process would take about an hour, and I had already gone over. The paint stayed wet and I was able to keep going. I just kept working in small areas and constantly adding in more of the red paint that was getting lost. Then I used a brush to pull the paint down on the edges of the canvas. As I approached hour 3, the batteries to my lights started to die, then my camera died. I got the canvas to a point I was happy with and left it to dry for about 4 days. This process made a giant mess. Despite putting down plastic and a drop cloth, paint still managed to get on anything that was near the canvas. Luckily it can be chipped off pretty easily or cleaned up with water, but if you plan on doing something like this, just know you're going to make a mess. But in the end, it was all worth it. Overall, the entire canvas looks cohesive, and the colors make the work look thought out and created on purpose. There were only a few areas where the paint cracked, and some portions have this nice splatter or specking. It's still flat enough to display Shatterpoint on, and when it's hanging on the wall, it looks like it's from the Museum of Modern Art. I mean, these are actual pieces of artwork from the Museum of Modern Art. And if those can be in it, why not this? It just needs a good name, like Untitled Number 2, parentheses, The Burning of Constantinople. $1 million, please. Flipping the board over, I now need a base to fill in the back of the canvas. And to do that, I will be using a bunch of this scrap styrofoam. Pieces are lined up and dry fitted into position. My insulation knife will be used to cut the foam to size. The insulation knife is super sharp and will give me a nice clean cut. Make sure you watch those fingers. With the pieces cut, they are fixed into place with Gorilla Glue. I ran a test on the back of my trial canvas and the foam stayed down and the glue didn't mess with the painted side behind it. Glue is poured out all over the back of the canvas and the wooden stretcher bars. The foam is then pressed into place and some weight is added on top while the glue dries. This last section is where the canvas will hang on the wall, so before the foam was glued down, a 1/2 inch piece of PVC was measured out and cut to height. The PVC will go around the nail or screw in the wall and will prevent it from tearing into the board. Everything then gets glued down. After a few hours of drying time, the foam could have some elevation and form cut into it. I want to keep the board mostly flat, since I use scattered terrain and don't want to commit to anything major, but I will make some rock formations out of tree bark. This bark is from a honey locust tree and has some good vertical veins that will make a realistic rock face. The cut foam is cleaned up and some offcuts are used to cover the seam between the foam and the stretcher bar. The tree bark is glued down with some Gorilla Glue, and I use the side of my X-Acto blade to blend the cut out foam with the rest of the board. So right now the board has some set rocks in this corner, and I'm trying to make this dried up riverbed that plays off the diagonal of the stretcher bar. After adding the bark, the rock forms now protrude higher than the rest of the canvas, and it will not hang flat on the wall and it could scratch the table if I'm using the other side. To get the height of the canvas back, I bought some black foam weather stripping. The weather stripping is 3/4 inch wide and almost 1/2 inch high. The weather stripping will take the impact and prevent static grass from being smushed, or the rocks from breaking. And the black of the foam works as a nice boundary for the terrain's ending. Now the styrofoam needs to be sealed. If you've ever seen anyone on YouTube make terrain before, they use something called sculpt-a-mold or modeling compound. It's a powdered compound that you mix with water, and you can create natural looking landforms with it. You can buy it at specialty hobby stores or online, but I didn't do that because I'm pretty sure I can make my own using Easy Sand. Easy Sand is a joint compound for plastering drywall. You can buy it in 18-pound bags for like 12 to 15 bucks. And I'm going to be mixing it with some shredded pieces of toilet paper. The good kind, the thick quilty stuff. The toilet paper will help build up the plaster's form while still keeping the board light. It's just sort of like paper mache on steroids. Easy Sand and the shredded toilet paper are mixed together, and water is mixed in. There isn't an exact measurement I can give you, you just want it to be like the consistency of partly melted ice cream. This mixture gets spread out over the rock face and the seams between the stretcher bar and the styrofoam. This type of Easy Sand has a 45-minute work time and starts out very sticky, but is able to be smoothed out after a few minutes. The remaining exposed styrofoam is covered in a layer of just the drywall plaster and water, no toilet paper. I thought I could add some small rocks and conduit and it would be held in place by the wet plaster, but it didn't work. They had to be glued down and I spray painted the bark gray. The spray painted bark was covered in a black wash, and while that dried, the plaster was painted a red and brown mix. The red was added in to warm it up a bit. While I was waiting for things to dry, some soil from outside was sifted through a strainer to get a fine dirt powder. I had to do this because the sanded grout I bought looked a little too bright. Spoonfuls of dirt were added to the grout until I got a tone of brown I wanted. Watered down PVA was brushed over the now dried paint and the grout was sifted on top. The rocks were dusted off and the excess grout was vacuumed up. Before another layer of watered down PVA was added, make sure you wear a dust mask when using grout, especially when you vacuum it up. I wanted the rocks to have some color in them, so 2 layers of highlights were added, with each having a touch of blue in it. Adding colors to your neutrals will make everything look more vibrant. Some static grass was applied in patchy sections to allow the dirt underneath to still be visible. The static grass is a 5mm mix of dark greens and browns, to make it look like a hardy grass that can handle colder weather. While I was putting the grass down, I decided this side of the board should be an autumn-themed environment, with yellowish grass and piles of dead leaves. With this plan in mind, another batch of static grass was mixed together that was more yellow than the one before it, and used to fill in some of the larger spaces of dirt. With this layer of autumn grass in place, I can now work on the dead leaves. I bought a leaf punch from Green Stuff World that can make tiny die-cut leaves from real dead leaves, but it takes a while. And to cover a board this size with hole punch leaves, you'd have to be nuts. Instead, I used the leftovers and mulched them with a pair of scissors. I then strain the leaf mulch and separate the fine cuts from the bigger ones. This gives me 3 layers of leaf texture: a fancy die-cut perfect leaf, a fine leaf pulp, and a coarse mix of cut leaves. The big coarse mix is placed down at the edges of the rocks, where the grass and dirt meet, and the fine mix is used to blend the tiles together. Then finally the die-cut leaves are added on top. It's kind of like in a video game, how the player models are the best, then the NPCs are okay, and the characters in the background are kind of horrifying. With the leaves in place, some of the fine sifted dirt is applied over the grass. This will work like an Agrax earth shade of sorts. The fine soil will help mute the vibrance of the static grass and help blend the different colored areas together. I'm using a sifter on top of the jar and shaking upward to prevent too much from spilling out. I alternate between dirt and adding more leaves, dropping some from a higher distance to see where they land. Once I'm happy with how it looks, some watered down PVA is mixed up, and using a pipette, the heavy leaf buildup is covered. The leaves being wet with glue will be less likely to be blown around by the spray bottle when the entire board is covered. I sprayed 2 thin coats of PVA over everything and left it to dry. I also want to mention that before you clean everything up, you want to take the grout and the leaves and some of the grass and put it in a big container that you'll be able to dip your miniatures into, and it will match the board perfectly. With the grass dry and the leaves set in place, I added in some autumn trees that I made, and this project was finished. Overall, I feel like this idea was a success. The canvas has 2 playable surfaces, and it can hang on the wall to class this place up a bit. It was relatively cost effective as well. I believe I was able to complete both sides for under $100. And this will definitely be something I return to in the future, as I try to improve this process. If that sounds good, or you want to see how I made these autumn trees, make sure you come back and check those videos out.